Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, here to kick off week 1 of the It's All Right Mystery Knit-Along, hosted by my friends from Makers Mercantile. Today, since we're knitting a Möbius, I'm going to show you how to do a Möbius cast-on. A Möbius is an unusual shape for knitters because there is only one side, the right side, and only one edge, the bound-off edge. It's knit in the round, and like my sample here, it has this little half twist that makes it a sort of three-dimensional figure 8. The magic of this shape happens at the cast on. My cast on stitches here in my sample are blue, and you can see that they're at the center of the piece, not on an edge. The first round of knitting is worked into the stitches above the cast on and below the cast on. From there, you just continue knitting in the round. So every round of the Möbius adds stitches to both this side of the cast on and this side of the cast on. Finally, let's follow the orange bound off stitches around so you can see the figure 8. The bind off starts, goes around the piece, up across the front where this half twist is, then back across and back down in this three-dimensional figure 8. So even though a Möbius looks like a complicated piece, casting on is simpler than you probably think. However, you will need to pay attention to what you're doing and count very carefully as you're casting on because we're going to be casting on a lot of stitches. I am going to be demonstrating the process on shorter circular needles with less cast on stitches than you'll be using for the actual Möbius because it's a little bit easier for me to manage on camera. But the overall process is going to be exactly the same for you. Let's get started. Like most cast-ons, the Möbius cast-on starts with a slip knot that tightens when you pull on the working yarn. So just place that loop onto your right hand needle and tighten things up. And to get the cast-on to work properly, your knitting needle needs to be positioned like a spring. The right hand needle is at the back of the spring. The cord loops around and your left hand needle is at the front of the spring. As you're casting on and working your Möbius, neither needle tip should pass through the center of the spring. They both need to stay outside and above that cord. So now let me get back to my knitting needles. My right hand needle is at the back of the spring. My cord loops around, and then my left hand needle is at the front of the spring. And it's really helpful at this point if you can kind of get that cord evened out so that the needle tips are close together and the cord all the way around is like the same length. That will make things a little bit easier later. So as you start knitting the first round, you don't have to do a lot of shifting of the needles and cord. You only have to worry about your stitches. So I'm going to keep holding the right hand needle and the cord, but I'm going to let go of this left hand needle. Again, just making sure that it never passes through the center of this spring as we're casting on. I'm going to slide the slip knot down the needle, around the cord, and just a little bit past the needle tip. And as I'm doing that, I just want to make sure that I don't tighten up that slip knot because at some point this loop is going to go around the cord and have to slide back up the other needle. So I don't want it too tight. So just make sure that as you're casting on the first few stitches here that slip knot doesn't get tightened up. If you're already familiar with the Möbius cast-on, you have likely used the method that Kat Bordy introduced to knitters, which is based on the provisional cast-on. Today, I'm going to show you an alternative method that's a little bit closer to the Turkish cast-on. In the end, both are going to produce pretty much the same results. Like the provisional cast-on, a Turkish cast-on is a double-sided cast-on, meaning you can work into both the top and the bottom of the cast-on stitches. So to cast on our stitches, we're simply going to wrap the yarn counterclockwise in relation to the tip of the needle. And we'll need to wrap around both the cord and the needle. So to do that, we're going to bring the yarn ball through the spring and then over the needle. Again, just be sure that you're not tightening up that slip knot at the beginning, and you may want to move that tail out of the way. I like to use my index finger to just hold that stitch in place. And as we're counting our cast on stitches, we're only counting what is cast onto the needle. We're not counting what's wrapped around the cord at this point. So I have one stitch on my needle. I'm going to pull the yarn ball forward through the spring and then over the needle. That's 2, and I'm going to hold things in place with my index finger. Bring the yarn through the spring and over the needle. 3, through the spring and over the needle. Through the spring and over the needle. As you're casting on, a couple things to remember. First, you need to watch your tension. You want these stitches to hug the cord and the needle together. You don't need to strangle the needle though. The stitches should be able to fairly freely slide up and down the needle and the cord without too much resistance. Also, as you're casting on, you want each wrap to be close to the previous wrap. You don't want them super spread out, or you'll end up with too much yarn in your cast on, and then things will look sloppy later. So again, just keep casting on stitches by bringing the yarn ball forward through the spring and over the needle. Since you need to cast on a lot of stitches, you could use stitch markers to help you keep your count by sliding a stitch marker onto your needle after every certain number of stitches. I personally would rather just pay attention to what I'm doing here and count very carefully, because those stitch markers could possibly make things a little bit more fidgety to work as you're working that first round. And also, you have to remember that those stitch markers are just for counting purposes. As you're working the first round of your knitting, you would need to remember to remove them from your cast on stitches. So as you can see, this is not terribly difficult, but you do need to pay attention to the counting, and you need to pay attention to your tension so things don't get too tight. And gradually, as you get more and more stitches, you'll need to start pushing things down the needle and onto the cord. So you just keep casting on stitches until you have the right amount. My stitches are all cast on, and I'm pretty much ready here to start knitting, but I'm going to need to shift the stitches up to that left-hand needle tip. Before I do that, I'm going to move my yarn here out of the way to the right and get it in position so that I can start knitting. And you just need to make sure that this left needle tip hasn't passed through the center of your spring, which mine hasn't. And I'm going to hold my 2 needle tips kind of close together so that I can shift the stitches around my needles and up that left needle tip. And the slip knot is the first thing that's going to slide up onto the left needle, followed by my other stitches. I think I may have tightened my slip knot up a little bit more than I wanted, but it will be okay. So it's going to feel a little bit awkward as you're shifting your stitches up. Make sure nothing leapfrogs over the top of that slip knot, because that's the first stitch you want to knit into. And as you're shifting things up the needle, there's one slick little thing that you can do here to help make things easier. You can kind of adjust your tension. So at the base of the needle, twist the stitches, and you can see how things are opening up. That makes it easier to slide everything up the needle. So slide some stitches up, open things up and slide them up the needle. And then once you have stitches on the needle, tighten them up again by twisting in the opposite direction. Again, you don't have to twist super hard. This kind of happens naturally. So you don't really have to worry if things are uneven in your tension around the knitting needles. Don't worry about it. You're going to fix it up here at the tip. So tighten it, not too tight. Again, you still want them to be able to slide up and down the needle. And then, now that everything's up at the tip, I'm ready to start knitting. Before I do though, I'm going to place a stitch marker onto that right hand needle to mark the beginning of my round. Let me flip that to the front so it's not my way as I knit. So again, this first stitch that we're working into is the slip knot from the very beginning. So I'll knit into the slip knot, and the pattern for my first round here is just knit 5, purl 5. Like I said, I think I tightened up my slip knot a little bit too much at the beginning. But once you get that first stitch worked, it works itself out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So one of the advantages of doing a Möbius cast on with this Turkish method is that you have a little bit more control over the tension, and it makes sliding the stitches up the needle a little bit easier. The other advantage to doing it this way is that all of your stitches will have a conventional stitch mount in this first half of round 1. When you use the provisional method, your stitch mount is alternating. So one stitch will have a conventional mount with the right hand or leading leg at the front, and then the next stitch would be reverse mounted with the right hand leg of the stitch at the back. So things might feel a little bit tight and weird here as you're working around the first half of the round. That's okay. You might see your cords bulging in places out. Again, that's okay. You're going to be able to fix that as you go. I think I went 1 stitch too far in my knit 5, purl 5. And then again, as I'm shifting stitches up my left hand needle, at the base of the needle, twist one direction so that it loosens things up, so it makes it easy to slide up the cord. And then once they're actually mounted up on your needle, twist in the other direction to tighten things up. And just make sure the stitches aren't leapfrogged over the top of each other. So I'm just going to continue working in the round until I get halfway around, and then I'll show you what happens next. So I've almost made it halfway around the first round of my little sample Möbius. And when you get to the halfway point of the round, you should notice 2 things. First of all, let me move the yarn tail out of the way. Your stitch marker should be hanging here on the cord directly under the tips of your needles, which mine is. You should also notice at this point, once you reach the halfway mark, as you're knitting in pattern, for this particular pattern, our knit 5, purl 5 that we're doing, You're going to be working your stitches as they appear, which means as you continue that knit 5, purl 5 pattern, you're going to be purling into the purls and knitting into the knits. If you use stitch markers at the beginning to help you keep track of your stitch count as you cast on, once you reach this halfway point is where you would meet up with those stitch markers again, and you would need to take them off of your knitting needles because you don't need them for the pattern. And we can just continue knitting around, shifting our stitches until we get back to that stitch marker at the beginning of the round. When you meet up with that stitch marker that's at the tip of your left hand needle again, that means that you have completed the first round of your It's All Right Möbius, and you can transfer the stitch marker from the left needle to the right and just continue working the pattern in the round for the remainder of the Möbius. And I think you'll find that after you complete that first round, it's going to be a lot easier to shift your stitches around the needles as you work. Thank you for casting on with me. If you'd like more information about the knit along, head over to the Makers Mercantile group on Ravelry and look for the It's All Right MKAL discussion thread. That's where you can share pictures of your progress, ask questions, and cheer on other knitters. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!